Homeless man with photographic memory notices something strange, suddenly runs to find police. A van with no plates. 2 men inside. One of them, a face he knew all too well from the front page of yesterday's paper. Hey, Chapman's heart pounded as he made a choice that would turn him from an invisible man to an unlikely hero. Hey, Chapman wasn't always a man with nothing but the clothes on his back and an uncanny gift. Once upon a time, he was a hard-working air conditioning installer and locksmith in the bustling heart of San Francisco. His hands were rough but skillful, crafting solutions to keep homes cool and doors secure. He had built a life with pride, one day at a time. But life has a cruel way of dismantling even the strongest foundations. A dull ache in his lower back morphed into a searing, unrelenting pain. The doctors called it chronic back pain, a diagnosis that felt more like a prison sentence. Every twist and turn became agony, every step a reminder of what he had lost. Soon, Chapman's steady hands faltered, and so did his livelihood. The downward spiral was swift. Bills piled up like an avalanche, crushing every ounce of stability he had. Selling his beloved tools bought him a few months' reprieve, but it wasn't enough. The landlord's eviction notice was the final blow. Chapman found himself alone on the streets, his only companions being the cold concrete and the relentless hum of the city. Yet, even in his darkest days, one thing kept him going: his children. Memories of their laughter, their little hands clutching his, and their wide-eyed dreams reminded him that giving up wasn't an option. One day, he told himself, "I'll get back on my feet for them." The streets of San Francisco became Chapman's reluctant home, and Golden Gate Park his sanctuary. Here, amidst the towering trees and morning fog, he carved out a semblance of routine, a fragile thread of normalcy in an otherwise chaotic life. Each morning, Chapman would wake with the sunrise, his body stiff from sleeping on a park bench. He'd stretch, shake off the night's chill, and make his way to the nearest trash bins. While others might see garbage, Chapman saw opportunity. Newspapers discarded by hurried commuters became his portal to the world. Headlines, stock prices, crime reports, he absorbed it all like a sponge. His photographic memory, a skill that had once helped him excel as a locksmith, now became his greatest ally. Every now and then, he'd treat himself to a cup of coffee from McDonald's. The familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee offered him a small slice of comfort, a fleeting reminder of better days. The staff there knew his face, though not his story. They'd nod politely, their eyes avoiding the threadbare jacket and worn-out shoes. Chapman wasn't alone in his struggles. He often exchanged nods or quiet conversations with other homeless individuals who shared his corner of the world. Stories of lost jobs, broken families, and dreams deferred filled the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Yet, Chapman always listened, never forgetting a single detail. It was as if the weight of their words became part of him. Through it all, his mind remained sharp. He memorized the city's rhythm, the ebb and flow of traffic, the patterns of passers-by, and even the tiniest details others overlooked. To Chapman, the world wasn't just a chaotic blur. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved. That fateful morning began like any other. Chapman entered McDonald's, the jingle of the doorbell momentarily drowning out the din of the busy street. He ordered his usual, a small coffee black, and took his seat near the window. Outside, the city moved at its usual frenetic pace. People rushed by, heads buried in phones, oblivious to the world around them. But Chapman noticed everything. The flickering neon sign of the pharmacy across the street. The man in the navy blue suit who always ordered 2 breakfast sandwiches. The street performer juggling oranges while humming an off-tune melody. Then he saw it, a van parked near the Whole Foods across the street. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable. But Chapman's keen eyes quickly spotted the anomaly. No license plates. 2 men sat inside, their heads tilted back as if asleep. Yet something about their stillness felt wrong. It wasn't the relaxed posture of someone catching a nap. It was tense, almost calculated. The hairs on the back of Chapman's neck stood up. He took another sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on the van. As one of the men stepped out to stretch, Chapman's heart skipped a beat. The man's face was eerily familiar, though Chapman couldn't place it immediately. He racked his brain, sifting through the catalog of faces stored in his memory, like a human Rolodex. Then it hit him. The face staring back at him was Hussein Neri, the fugitive whose mugshot had been plastered across every newspaper just days ago. Neri, along with his accomplice, had orchestrated a daring escape from Orange County Jail, a feat that had left authorities scrambling and the public on edge. Chapman's mind raced. The van, the men, the missing plates, it all made sense now. The very men who had captured the nation's attention were sitting just yards away. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the gravity of the situation. Should he ignore it? Pretend he hadn't seen anything? His instinct screamed at him to stay out of it. After all, who would listen to a homeless man? But deep down, Chapman knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Gripping his coffee cup tightly, he made a decision that would change everything. As Chapman caught his breath, leaning against the cold brick wall of the alley, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the chaotic scene around him. Officers surrounded the van, their voices sharp and commanding, ordering the remaining suspect inside to surrender. The man in the driver's seat, Jonathan T., Hussein Neri's equally notorious accomplice, was frozen in shock, his wide eyes darting around for an escape that didn't exist. He had nowhere left to run. Chapman watched as the officers cautiously approached, their weapons drawn, inching closer until the inevitable surrender came. The door creaked open, and Jonathan stepped out slowly, his hands trembling in the air. "Got him," one officer muttered into his radio, satisfaction heavy in his voice. Chapman stood still, the weight of the moment finally settling in. It was surreal. Just hours ago, he had been a nameless figure lost in the crowd, and now he had helped capture two of the most wanted men in the state. As the officers conducted a thorough search of the van, Chapman couldn't help but stare. He watched as they pulled out stacks of stolen credit cards, fake IDs, and rolls of cash. Weapons, hidden under the seats, were carefully collected and cataloged. He felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion wash over him. A soft breeze drifted through the street, and for the first time in a long while, Chapman exhaled with relief. He had done it, he had taken a risk, and it had paid off. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Chapman's name was everywhere. Newspapers splashed his face across the front pages, alongside bold headlines. "Homeless hero helps catch fugitives." His story spread like wildfire. Reporters camped outside the police station, desperate for a quote, a glimpse of the man who had risked everything to do the right thing. "Mr. Chapman," one eager reporter called out, shoving a microphone towards him. "How did you recognize them?" Chapman blinked, taken aback by the sudden attention. I read the news," he said simply. "I remember things." That single statement made him an internet sensation overnight. The public marveled at his photographic memory, dubbing him the walking encyclopedia. Social media exploded with admiration. "This guy is proof that heroes can come from anywhere. Never underestimate someone just because of their circumstances. Give this man a home already." Chapman was overwhelmed by the sudden flood of attention. Strangers approached him in the streets, some offering him money, others simply wanting to shake his hand. Even the police, initially skeptical of his claims, were in awe. At a press conference, the police chief publicly praised him. Without Mr. Chapman's sharp memory and quick action, these dangerous criminals might still be on the loose. He displayed incredible bravery, and we are grateful for his contribution. For the first time in years, Chapman felt seen, not as a vagrant, not as an invisible figure fading into the city's background, but as someone who mattered. Then came the moment that truly changed everything. Chapman sat in the police precinct, still reeling from the events of the past 24 hours, when an officer handed him an envelope. "The city wanted to thank you properly," the officer said with a smile. Chapman opened it, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a check, $100,000. His eyes widened. His mind raced. Was this real? "This is for me?" he asked, barely believing the words coming out of his mouth. The Orange County Board of Supervisors wanted to reward your efforts. You could have walked away, but you didn't. You stepped up. For the first time in years, Chapman allowed himself to dream. He could afford to rent an apartment, his own space, with a lock he could trust. He could buy new clothes, get a fresh start, maybe even reach out to his kids, show them he was turning things around. But Chapman didn't just think about himself. As he walked out of the precinct, the crisp check in his pocket, his eyes wandered to the faces of the people he had once called friends, the homeless men and women sitting on the same sidewalks he had known too well. He knew what it was like to feel invisible, and now he had a chance to change that. That night, Chapman found himself back at Golden Gate Park, sitting among his old companions. The same park bench, the same cold air, but everything felt different. "You got lucky, hey," one of them said, nudging him. "No," Chapman replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I paid attention." He spent the next few weeks carefully planning his next steps. He found a small apartment in the Mission District, modest but his own. He invested in a suit, something he'd never imagined wearing again. And perhaps most importantly, he reached out to his children, arranging a meeting after years of estrangement. "I just want to make things right," he told them, his voice thick with emotion. And for the first time, they listened. Chapman knew life wouldn't change overnight. There would still be challenges, but for once, he wasn't running from them. He was facing them head-on. Standing in his new apartment, Chapman looked around. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but it was his. He had spent years on the streets, convinced that life had abandoned him. But now, he realized that every face, every headline he had ever memorized had led him to this moment. He had been forgotten by the world, but in an instant, he had proven that everyone, no matter their circumstances, had the power to make a difference. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, Chapman couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of something new. In the quiet moments, long after the reporters had packed up and the police cars had vanished into the city's noise, Chapman sat in his modest new apartment, staring at the blank walls. For the first time in years, he had something resembling stability. But stability wasn't enough. It was time to ask himself a difficult question. What really matters? For years, survival had been his only priority. Finding the next meal, securing a safe place to sleep, making it through the night. But now, with a second chance in his hands, Chapman realized something profound. Survival wasn't the same as living. He thought about the people he'd met on the streets, the forgotten faces, the ones who had been written off by society. He thought about the lessons he'd learned: resilience, adaptability, the art of noticing the unnoticed. "I can't just leave it all behind," he whispered to himself. His journey couldn't end with a check and an apartment lease. It had to mean something more. Driven by this realization, Chapman began volunteering at local shelters, sharing his experience and sharp memory to help others navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth that often stood between them and a fresh start. He helped homeless individuals fill out job applications, guided them to resources, and shared his story, proving that change was possible, no matter how bleak things seemed. Every small victory, whether it was someone getting their ID restored or simply finding the courage to seek help, felt like a step towards something greater. Chapman wasn't just rebuilding his life. He was helping others do the same. "I've been where you are," he would say, looking them in the eye. "And I know the way out." Chapman never expected his story to resonate so deeply. Yet it did. People from all over the country reached out, sharing messages of hope and admiration. Letters poured in, some from strangers inspired by his courage, others from people who had once ignored him on the streets, now seeing him in a different light. But the most unexpected response came from his family. It had been years since he had spoken to his children. The shame of his circumstances had created an invisible barrier between them, one he feared could never be mended. But then a phone call came. "Dad." A familiar voice hesitated on the other end. "I saw you on the news." Chapman's throat tightened. "Yeah, kiddo? It's me." The conversation was awkward at first, but as the minutes passed, years of silence began to dissolve. His children had thought he was lost forever, swallowed up by the city's shadows. Now, they saw him for who he truly was: a fighter, a survivor, a father who had never given up. The support extended beyond his family. The local police, once wary of his presence on the streets, now treated him with respect. One officer even invited him to share his story at a community outreach event, using his experience to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the homeless community. Ordinary people, those who once walked past him without a second glance, now stopped to shake his hand, offering encouragement and, sometimes, a heartfelt thank you. Chapman never considered himself a hero, but in the eyes of many, he had become just that. Standing before a crowd at a community event, Chapman took a deep breath and looked out at the faces watching him. Some were business professionals, some were young students, and some were people who, like him, had once called the streets their home. He cleared his throat, feeling the weight of his journey pressing against his chest. And then he spoke. Sometimes the people the world forgets are the ones who end up doing the most extraordinary things. A hush fell over the crowd. I was invisible, just another face in the crowd. But the truth is, we all have something valuable inside of us. I had my memory, my attention to detail, and that made a difference. But more than that, I had hope. And if you take anything from my story today, let it be this. No one is beyond saving. Not me. Not you. No one. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Chapman wasn't looking for praise. His message was simple, about resilience, about second chances, and about how courage isn't reserved for superheroes. It lives in everyday choices. I had a new mission now. With the reward money, Chapman invested in programs that supported the homeless community, providing them with tools to rebuild their lives, just as he had. From job training to mental health support, he wanted to ensure that others didn't have to fight the same uphill battle alone. He made it a point to walk through the same streets he once called home, not to relive the past, but to remind himself how far he had come, and how far he could still go. Hey, Chapman's story wasn't just about catching fugitives or a reward check. It was about something deeper, about finding purpose when everything seemed lost, about proving that no one is truly invisible, no matter how far they've fallen. He had learned that life isn't about the circumstances you find yourself in, but about the choices you make within them. And as he sat on a park bench, watching the world move around him, Chapman smiled to himself. He was no longer lost. He was found. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never expected to be. Hey, Chapman's story is a powerful reminder that true heroism doesn't always come from those in positions of power or privilege. It often emerges from the least expected places. His journey from being an invisible figure on the streets to a celebrated hero proves that everyone has something valuable to offer, even when society overlooks them. Chapman's extraordinary memory and unwavering courage in the face of fear highlight the importance of paying attention, trusting one's instincts, and taking action when it matters most. His story inspires us to see beyond appearances and recognize the hidden potential within ourselves and others. More than just a tale of redemption, Chapman's experience teaches us that second chances are real and that no one is beyond hope. His determination to turn his life around, not just for himself but for those around him, serves as a beacon of resilience and empathy. It's a call to action for all of us, to be more aware, more compassionate, and to remember that even in our lowest moments, there is always a path forward. Chapman's story reminds us that no matter where life takes us, it's our choices that define us, and with courage and persistence, we can rewrite our own narratives.